Good afternoon and welcome to PeptiDream's second quarter 2022 earnings call. This is Yan-Ting Chen, Head of Business Planning and Development at PeptiDream. With me today on this call is Patrick Reid, Chief Executive Officer of PeptiDream. During today's call, Patrick will provide some recent updates and perspectives. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. After the presentation, there will be a question and answer session. I would like to remind you that this call will contain remarks concerning PeptiDream's future expectations, plans, and prospects. Actual results may differ materially from those indicated by these forward-looking statements as a result of various important factors. In addition, any forward-looking statements represent our views only as of the date of this call and should not be relied upon as representing our views as of any subsequent date. We specifically disclaim any obligations to update such statements. Today's call is recorded and will be disclosed on the PeptiDream website. And with that, I'd like to turn the call over to Patrick.
Hi, thank you, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. First, I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to listen to our presentation today. This is the first time that we're doing the results presentations both in English and in Japanese to cover a broader or wider audience of current investors and or potential investors. Today's financial results presentation will be covering, of course, the second quarter and or the first half of the fiscal year for 2022. So with that, if you go to slide 2, so we'll cover an outline of the consolidated fiscal year Q2 financial results covering the first half. And then also I'll update briefly on the progress of certain key R&D programs and their future development plans. And then we can move into a Q&A session if there are any questions and or specific comments that we'd like to address or discuss. So if you go to slide 3, into slide 4. So on slide 4, just illustrates a depiction of the growing PeptiDream strategic investment and or network of affiliated companies. On the lower right is PDR Radiopharma, which was previously the Fuji Toyoma radiopharmaceutical business that we acquired in March, originally announced in 2021 and then closed in March 28, 2022. This is an established platform, the clinical development, approval, marketing, and sales of radiopharmaceutical compounds or drugs in Japan. They actually already have 24 marketed diagnostics and 8 marketed therapeutics on the market, plus 3 compounds in clinical development, which we'll briefly touch on. The goal of this business, of course, is a 100% owned subsidiary of PeptiDream now, and transforming this quickly into a profitable, high-growth business are the key goals. So we'll touch on the radiopharma aspect more briefly in subsequent slides. 2 other companies, which are sister companies of ours, to which we own a 39.4% stake and a 39.5% stake, PeptiGrowth and PeptiAid. PeptiAid we'll touch on today, the progress of the PA001, which is a therapeutic for the COVID-19 that is moving toward clinical development, and as we released this afternoon, has just completed the clinical research and shown a clean safety and tolerability profile across the therapeutic doses that we're intending. So we'll touch on that more briefly. PeptiGrowth is a development and commercialization company of peptide alternatives to growth factors. And PeptiDream maintains the therapeutic rights to those programs, whereas PeptiGrowth, of course, has the rights to ex vivo use and or a research use of those compounds. There was 2 products launched in 2021. 2 additional products were launched to date in 2022, and we're expecting to continue to launch additional products going forward for this company. Both of these companies are under the 40% ownership threshold, as we'll discuss in a subsequent slide. The other 3 shareholding components or stakes that we have are around the less than 15% stake in PeptiStar, which is a peptide CDMO business or a contract manufacturing organization that produces high quality, large scale amounts of GLP or GMP grade peptides for clinical development and or commercial sale. We also have a 5% stake in a strategic partner, Reid Bio, to which we are developing RI peptide conjugate therapeutics, where we're intending to actually announce the first development candidate coming from one of the lead programs here in the second half of 2022. We also have secured the rights, as we announced yesterday, to all of those collaboration programs. We now have the Japan rights to those programs for us to develop those in Japan. Well, again, I'll touch on that more briefly in a subsequent slide. We have less than a 5% stake in Modulus, which is another bioventure that is actually using computational drug discovery to turn peptide seeds into small molecule compounds. We're basically going after kinase targets in that collaboration, and the lead program is actually expected to move into GLP IND stage here in the second half of 2022. So we go to the next slide. As far as the consolidation with the closing of the acquisition of the PDR Radiopharma business, which is of course again 100% subsidiary of PeptiDream now, we have grouped the original three business aspects or three businesses of PeptiDream: the collaboration and drug discovery business, the PDPS technology licensing business, and the strategic alliance in-house business into what we're calling the drug discovery and development business segment, listed as number 1. And then now the PDR Radiopharma business, which is listed as number 4 there, covering the R&D, manufacturing, sales, and commercializations of radiopharmaceuticals in Japan, is listed as business segment number 2, or the radiopharmaceutical business segment. These are being consolidated in our accounting now, of course, because it's 100% owned subsidiary of PeptiDream. The two other affiliated companies are the PeptiGrowth and PeptiAid. Our ownership stake, of course, is less than 40%, and so they are not consolidated from an accounting perspective, but they are accounted for under the equity method because they are above the 15% ownership threshold and below the 40% threshold, which means they have to be accounted for in this respect. The other three stakes, as I mentioned, the PeptiStar, Raise, and Modulus, of course, are below the 15% threshold to which we have to account for those companies. Go to the next slide. Slide 6 is the overview of the financial performance of the company through the first half of the current fiscal year. The drug discovery and development business is on track to meet our full year goals with a number of active deal discussions and/or progress across the pipeline and relevant programs, making good progress, of course. We also, from the radiopharmaceutical business, have seen steady progress in the PMI, and also, as we'll touch on briefly, the first quarter post-acquisition was in fact profitable. So I'll explain a little bit more around that. The key messages for this slide is through the first half year, we roughly had, I guess, is 5 billion yen in sales in total revenue. Our guidance for the current fiscal year is unchanged at 24.5 billion yen. Of course, this is only about a 20% progress rate through the first half, but we're expecting in Q3 and Q4 to continue and meet the forecast. So there's unchanged in the forecast to date, even given that we're only through 20% so far. Also, there's no change to our core operating profit guidance, which comes in at 6.6 billion yen for the two companies combined. Through the first half of the year, net income was actually minus 1 billion yen. However, this only came out to be about 622 million yen after comprehensive income was factored in thus far in the first half of this year. So if you go to the next slide. So again, this is a reconciliation of core basis to non-core basis as we've moved from JGAAP to IFRS accounting standards. And there's just a few minor differences, of course, that have to be accounted for with the change. But largely, of course, as I mentioned, revenue comes out at the 5 billion yen, and the various expenses we had to account for, M&A related costs and/or intangible assets are factored in under the IFRS regulations. But overall, no significantly drastic changes. Go to the next slide. So the outlook for the remaining outlook for the fiscal year in the drug discovery and development segment, which is largely the PeptiDream businesses, there's again no change in our full year forecasts anticipated. As is listed here, we thus far have only attained 1 billion yen in revenue thus far. However, the existing contracts, we can already see roughly 4 billion yen coming in. And then we are currently in negotiations for 3 different buckets here that are listed: an oligonucleotide PDC deal, which is actually encompassing more than one company that we expect to close here in the second half. That should bring in around 4 to 4.5 billion yen. An RI PDC, which is actually, again, more than one company that we're expecting to bring in 3.5 to 4 billion yen. And then there's some other PDC related deals that should bring in the remaining 1.1 to 1.5 billion yen, which puts us at a final mark of roughly between 13 to 15 billion yen in revenue for the current fiscal year. These deals that are listed in this gray box or blue box in the middle of the slide, all of these deals are deals that we actually started negotiating in 2021. Most of these deals involve assets that we've found the peptide internally, and then we've provided the peptide to the partner to actually conjugate their oligonucleotide and or RI payloads to undergo feasibility testing. So basically a proof of concept before they decided to enter a collaboration and or license these peptides from us. And so that is in part why these deals have taken time to actually formulate, and these negotiations have been going on, the feasibility studies, and then into the negotiations have been occurring for a number of months now. But we're fully confident, of course, that these are going to close in the second half of the year, given that they're largely toward the contract drafting stage at present. So go to the next slide. In relation to the radiopharmaceutical business segment, which is largely, of course, PDR Radiopharma, which is the name we've coined for the acquisition or the business we acquired. The company has made steady progress in its transition under the new corporate structure since we took over in March of this year. We are actually currently developing new midterm plans for the transformation to a high growth model. And there's a number of various initiatives underway to achieve near-term profitability. And we actually have already attained profitability in Q2. So this business under the Fuji umbrella largely operated in the red. It was marginally in the red, I would say, but regardless, it was in the red, operating as such. And in just the first quarter under our control, it's marginally in the black. And for the full 9 months that will be accounted for in this fiscal year, we expect revenue to be basically 11.5 billion yen, and the outcome of this to be, again, marginally in the black. So we've completely stabilized the business and are now looking at the various products that can feed into the PDR Radiopharma pipeline to put this on a strong and steady growth path. There are a couple of upside and or downside factors listed on the right of this slide. The upside that could potentially revise this forecast to the upside is the solid new product launch in 2021 of the RIA MIBG product, which is showing good market penetration and growing sales. We also seeing steady market share expansion of our FDG PET product from the business. And also there's been some recent upgrades to the SPECT imaging software that have been well received by the market, and also potentially could be contributing favorably to the upside to these forecasts. On the downside, there still remains 2 potential downsides. One is a decreasing number of patient visits to hospitals due to COVID-19. Probably as everyone on this call is very well aware, there has been a recent resurgence in COVID infections or SARS-2 infections in Japan, leading to some potential pressure on the number of hospital visits, which could then, of course, directly play into the number of patients that can actually be administered the products and diagnostic and therapeutic products sold by PDR Radiopharma. In addition to that, there's been a slow shrinking trend in the overall spec diagnostic business. Has been a move more toward the PET imaging business, and so there is, of course, some downside risk for the slow shrinkage of this overall spec diagnostic market. We've been able to see that shrinkage happen over time, so there doesn't seem to be any drastic changes. But again, as a potential downside factor, it's one that is we can account for it, but we're not sure exactly of its potential downside impact. But I would say at current, we're actually very, very confident in this 11.5 billion yen to come out, and if anything, potentially to the upside. And we expect this to be operating in the black. So if we go to the next slide. We've tried to touch on in a variety of aspects, the synergies between PeptiDream and PDR Radiopharma and why the acquisition of that company made so much sense for PeptiDream. PeptiDream, of course, has been finding the peptides for these RI peptide conjugates with various partners already. We have been doing this since our initial collaboration with Nihon Medi-Physics, but then also Novartis back in 2019, and also Reid Bio, a strategic partner, back in 2020. And so we had granted the rights, of course, the global rights to those compounds to those companies, and that we would simply receive milestones and royalties on sales of those products if they were to ever reach the market. Now, of course, with the acquisition of PDR Radiopharma, we actually have the ability to, say, maximize and or leverage those products into the Japan market. And so what we just announced 2 days ago was the fact that in our Reid collaboration, we've actually secured the Japan rights to all of the products and programs under that collaboration. So that, in fact, what we didn't have before the PDR Radiopharma acquisition was actually the ability to, say, develop, commercialize, and market those compounds in Japan. And now, post-acquisition, we have the ability to do that. And so this is actually very good for us. This will allow us to more leverage and maximize the sales of those compounds into the Japan market. In addition to that, of course, PeptiDream will receive the royalties, of course, on ex-Japan sales, and PDR Pharma will allow us to harvest the 100% of the sales in Japan. So this is a very exciting first step toward increasing the pipeline of PDR Radiopharma and putting this company on a solid growth trajectory going forward. In addition to that, we'll talk on a subsequent slide about further partners in the RI-PDC space or the radiopharm peptide space, and how we intend to maintain Japan rights for any future partnerships. And in addition, allows us to maximize our own internal programs as we carry them forward. So go to the next slide. The next slide is just an overview really of the consolidated balance sheet and financial status, of course. There isn't any real significant changes to the balance sheet. One of the major aspects is the ratio of equity that has changed. We, of course, as everyone's probably well aware, previously we were roughly operating around 90%. We actually had not had any debt at all to the company, and so had not been using debt in any real meaningful way, of course, to drive growth of the company. And now with the acquisition, because this acquisition was funded through long-term debt, of course, this has resulted in the ratio of equity to drop up to around 50%. We believe that this drop is only a short-term aspect. We're expecting for this year and next year, and then in the medium term, basically from 2024 going forward, to return this to above 70% ratio of equity as we pay down debt, of course, from the growth of the business and operating revenue coming from the business. So if you go to the next slide. The next slide is just a consolidated cash flow. Sorry, this is slide 12 for everyone's reference. At the end of the last fiscal year, we basically had the equivalent of 11.7 billion yen in cash and cash equivalents. Of course, with the investing activities and or the acquisition of the PDR Radiopharma business, there's been roughly 26.7 billion yen toward the investing activities. And then of course, cash flow from financing activities was the equivalent of about 21.5 billion yen, which is from the debt financing that we secured to acquire the company. And so at the end of the first half of this fiscal year, we now sit around 6.3 billion yen of cash and cash equivalents. And of course, as we're projecting the second half of this year to bring in a considerable amount of income, we expect this balance of cash and cash equivalents to return to where it was close to the end of the last fiscal year. So really areas of strategic focus, as we announced at our annual shareholders meeting in February, at the end of last year's financial release in February, and then reiterated at our annual shareholders meeting in March. A recap of kind of the main or major strategic directions of the company. And number one, of course, is to our continued focus on advancing PeptiDream's late-stage research programs, both partnered and in-house into clinical development. We're doing everything we can, of course, to accelerate the late stage or late preclinical stage programs to move these into the clinic. And then, of course, working with our strategic partners and collaboration partners to move those programs forward as effectively as possible, in addition to our own internal in-house programs. On the PDC segment, we have continued to expand our PDC programs. As we've touched on in the past, we are currently operating largely in the radioisotope peptide drug conjugate space and also the oligo peptide drug conjugate space, which we'll touch on in subsequent slides. But there's growing interest of using our peptides with other various payloads that we will have feasibility studies ongoing for, and will likely lead into 2022 and 2023 new deal making. The deals we aim to close in the second half of this year are largely around oligo peptide drug conjugates and radioisotope peptide drug conjugates. In addition to that, we continue to work on creating novel peptides that will enable new PDC approaches and build out those data packages and provide those peptides to companies under feasibility arrangements for them to look at. And then once we can generate the supportive data to actually enter into a license agreement and or collaboration agreement, which provides us or affords us higher financials from all aspects of these deals, which is important toward our growth. On the third aspect, of course, is putting the PDR radiopharma business, one stabilizing business, into a near-term profitability, which we feel like we've done, and that will show through the entirety of the remaining 6 months of this year. And then also putting that business on a strong growth trajectory by both providing, increasing the pipeline of PDR radiopharma through existing synergies and getting programs that we already have, getting the Japan rights to those programs to feed into the PDR radiopharma pipeline, and also utilizing the PeptiDream's network of partners to help PDR radiopharma in-license compounds into Japan to also fill out the pipeline. And so accelerating those major programs toward the achievement of our fiscal 2026 midterm goals across each of these three aspects is our key focus. So if you go to the next slide. So we have touched on this a few times in previous calls, but as we've consolidated revenue from this year and looking at our future outlook, in the current fiscal year, we're expecting roughly around 25 billion yen in revenue from the consolidated businesses. And of course, the PDR radiopharma is only 9 months of that being consolidated into those the current fiscal year sales. And for 2023, sorry, for the next year's, we're expecting 30 billion plus in revenue. Of course, we haven't made any forecasts for next year's or any guidance for next year's sales, but expecting it to be 30 billion yen plus. And then over the next 3 to 6 years, expecting this to get to around 50 billion yen in annual revenue, with then the 7 to 10 year long-term projections of being around 100 billion yen in sales, roughly $1 billion in sales within the next 7 to 10 years. And of course, this is largely accelerating those growth with the out-licensing of preclinical and clinical candidates that we have, the clinical approval milestones that come from advancing collaboration programs, sales royalties from launch products throughout the pipeline, and then of course PDR Radiopharma's contribution to this overall revenue. And we've given just a rough breakdown of how we believe this could play out, with PDR Pharma accounting for roughly, a 40% to 35% of overall that revenue on a long-term basis, but PeptiDream contributing to the majority of that revenue growth. So if we go to slide 15, is just some of the Q3, Q4 IR schedule events that we have. We, of course, have the current call in early September and late September. We're participating in a number of hosted IR conferences. And then in early October is continuing that with some additional conferences that we have scheduled to participate in, going toward the November 10th Q3 financial results release. And then in late November, we will continue on what we started last year, which will be an R&D day for 2022, which we had our first R&D day last year in 2021. And that's something that we'll continue going forward with an annual R&D day, normally scheduled for the late November timeline. Additional future catalysts that we're looking forward to here in the second half of this year is our next generation PD-L1 inhibitor program that's partnered with BMS. I'll touch on that briefly, but we're hoping for some development progress to be able to be announced. We're also looking forward to our CD38 ARM program, which is partnered with Biohaven, as that more moves toward, of course, the clinical readouts and potential results being able to be publicly shared. We had the PA001, which was just announced actually today during the afternoon, the clinical research results of a clean safety profile, which I'll touch on. And as we're going forward, we'll talk more about the future progress in our future development of that program. In addition, we have some initiation of some additional new clinical programs. Our amylite program, which we're expecting to advance in the clinic here in 2022, or a relatively near future. Our myostatin inhibitor program, which is a fully owned program, finalizing a clinical development plan here in 2022, with a goal of moving this into clinic in 2023. And then some exciting advances in our RI PDC programs, both internal with Novartis and with Reid. I'll touch on that briefly. And also in our oligonucleotide PDC programs, partnerships with Takeda and Alnylam, some events that we expect to announce here in the second half of this year. Of course, as I mentioned, some key revenue contributors to the second half of this year are some of these new deals and expansion and/or of oligo PDC programs, which will come from a new deal, one or more new deals that we have here scheduled for the second half. And of course, an RI PDC deal, one or two RI PDC deals, which we have scheduled for the second half. And also expansion of some PDPS licensing opportunities that are likely to happen here in the second half also, as new deal catalysts for the second half of this fiscal year. So if we proceed to the next slide. So I'll move into this section and touch on some of the key R&D and development programs that we currently have ongoing. If you go to slide 17. So on the subsequent 3 slides, we have listed the 33 programs that are currently from the lead to GLP tox stage onward. And the highlighted programs we'll touch on individually in subsequent slides here. And so number 1, of course, will be the PD-L1 program that we have partnered with Bristol Myers. Number 2 will be our COVID-19 program that is partnered with PeptiAid. Number 3 will be the amylite program, our GHR antagonist program that we have with amylite. And then number 4 will be our fully owned myostatin program that was initially started in a collaboration with Kawasaki Medical School. In addition to that, if you go to the next slide, slide 19, we'll also touch on our transferrin receptor targeting peptides, which are used for targeting various payloads to the CNS and/or toward muscle for neuromuscular diseases. There's multiple partners here, but the initial partner, of course, that we had publicly disclosed was with Takeda. So I'll touch on that briefly. In addition, I'll touch on the oligo PDC programs in general, So our partnership with Alnylam and some future partnerships that we intend to announce. And then number 6 is going to cover some of the RI-related PDCs, both across our in-house Novartis and Reid Bio related partnerships. So if you go to, so on slide 19, this is some of the undisclosed. I think as many on the call might be well aware, because of our business model and that the vast majority of our programs are partnered with foreign partners and or collaboration partners, that there's always been limits to the amount of information we're actually able to disclose. We have been working quite diligently to rectify this to the extent possible, to the point that I think we've reached good agreements with most of our collaboration partners that once a program reaches development candidate stage, that we will be in a position to disclose both the program's target and also the disease indication, and of course relevant partner to that. And so this is a number of information on these over the next number of quarters. We expect to be able to add a certain amount of transparency and color and details to these first 3 slides covering the 33 programs that are at this related stages. So please look forward to that. If you go to the next slide. So I'll try to touch on these briefly. On slide 20 is our next generation PDL1 inhibiting macrocyclic peptide that we have partnered with Bristol Myers Squibb. As everyone is probably very, very much aware, the immuno-oncology checkpoint market, certainly in the context of PD-1 and or PDL1 inhibitors, which is dominated by antibodies at this stage. I think there's 9 or 10 approved antibodies thus far on the market, to which BMS's Opdivo and Merck's Keytruda are the major sellers. The market is quite large and it's growing, actually forecast to be around $140 billion by 2030. What we have developed in collaboration with BMS is a next generation macrocyclic peptide that is not an injectable. And we believe that it has certain benefits over the existing antibodies that will make it an exciting next generation product. Included, there's just a couple here, the ability to control pharmacokinetics, reduce immunogenicity, of course, and also lifecycle management of, these are actually all quite new patents covering these that overlap with any of the existing antibody patents that cover the currently approved therapeutics on the market. So we're expecting significant market growth of this. This compound originally, or a derivative of this compound originally, entered the clinic in December of 2016 in a phase 1 study, but that was as an injectable. That was really to look at the safety and PK properties of that compound, which came out to be very favorable. And now the next generation compound, of course, is not injectable. And this actually started a phase 1 study here in April 2022. The study is being conducted in the UK, and this is the identification code is listed here. And actually going to the identification code, there's a link to the CMO, Quotient Biosciences, Quotient Sciences, that is running the clinical study, where there is a significant amount of information on those 2 pages in regards to the study design and modality, just so everyone knows. So I would welcome everyone to check that out. As everyone can imagine, due to the competitiveness of this area, Bristol Myers, of course, is limiting the amount of information that we can disclose in regards to this program. However, we will continue to work to disclose as much information as we possibly can in regards to this program. But this is an extremely exciting program that we think has a very, very large potential to contribute significantly to our long-term financials. If you go to the next slide. So our anti-COVID-19 drug candidate, PA001, which is partnered with Reid. We've disclosed some information on this compound in the past. Our macrocyclic peptide actually has very broad antiviral activity across all of the strains that have come out today, including the various Omicron mutants and or versions that have come out. In part, the reason for that is is our peptide binds to this S2 domain, to this yellow portion depicted in the middle here. This is a depiction of the S protein that resides on the surface of the SARS-2 coronavirus. Most of the antibody drugs that are on the market and or vaccines that you get are your body is generating antibodies that bind to the S1 domain. And the S1 domain is the part of the S protein that actually binds to the receptor on the surface of human cells. And this has been the region that has been highly mutagenic, of course, basically to evade your immune response or to evade antibodies that are binding to the S1 domain that would actually block it. Hence, we've had to have a number of generations of vaccines to date and may have to do so going forward. The beauty of the compound we found is this yellow part is actually a very needed functional part of the molecule, is not highly susceptible to change because mutations in this region usually render the virus to be null. And so our peptide, we believe, will continue to show broad efficacy across any future strains of the coronavirus. And in addition, that can be used in combination with both vaccines and or other current therapeutics and have a synergistic effect. And so we've seen this to be extremely potent and look forward to carrying this forward. If you go to the next slide. So we're planning, we just had completed, as we announced this afternoon, the clinical research, which basically was a single dose escalation study in human volunteers covering the intended therapeutic range. And there was basically a clean safety profile. There was no safety concerns and or related adverse events observed. And so we will also observe clear dose response pharmacokinetic profiles, both completing the intended goals of this study. And so now we're actually planning for future clinical development moving into 2023, which is currently believed to be with the injectable. And the goal of the trial design will be to establish the earliest proof of concept possible to move this, again, as quickly as possible. We're most likely to conduct this study in the US for a variety of reasons, but the main of which is the easiest and fastest to get enrollment of subjects, and also the usability of the generated data for out-licensing purposes. We have been in discussions with a number of large pharma companies around this program with a potential to out-license the program and or partner the program with major global pharmaceutical companies. So in part, having the US trial data would be helpful toward that end goal. We also continue to work on an oral formulation that may be a backup candidate to the current injectable. But given the therapeutic needs of the market, we believe the injectable is sufficient to establish the proof of concept and move this compound forward. So we look forward to updating, of course, investors in the market as we are able. If we go to the next slide, this is our GHR inhibitor program that we out-licensed to Amelite, I think about a year ago. It's a very exciting peptide that we generated. It's basically an alternative to the current standard of care, which is Sumovert on the market, sold by Pfizer. Sumovert is actually given as a daily injectable, which has a number of safety issues and or side effect profiles. One of which is it's actually not very good at controlling IGF levels, which is actually critical to the patient population. In addition to that, we believe this peptide can have a beneficial impact also on the somatostatin analog market, which is roughly around 6 billion in sales in 2021 and growing, to which certain patient populations don't respond well to the somatostatin compounds that are currently available. And so what we see recently, Amelite has been presenting some of the data that's been generated at various endocrine conferences, and seeing that the name of this compound is AZP3813, shows a rapid and sustained effect, much more so than Sumovert, and also it shows a faster off effect. Once you remove the drug, the patients return to normal very quickly, or the IGF levels return to baseline, which also has a significant therapeutic benefit. So all of this data in essence has shown the ability of this compound to very effectively control and suppress IGF-1 levels in the various models that have been looked at to date. It's currently in IND-enabling studies. According to Amylite, the goal is to have this into the clinic in 2022. And so as any news is updated on this from the Amylite side, we, of course, will update our shareholders in the market accordingly. So if you go to the next slide. One other program, that this is a fully owned program. We initially had started this under a collaboration with Kawasaki Medical School here in Japan, was an innovative peptide-based myostatin inhibitor for the treatment of DMD and or other muscular dystrophies. This is a macrocyclic peptide that we found that actually binds to and inhibits myostatin. Myostatin is a key factor involved in muscle, both muscle growth and the functionability of muscle, or the tensile strength of muscle. What myostatin does in these patients, actually the level, it has both an endocrine function, and an autocrine paracrine function. The autocrine function is something that's more happens on the overall systemic level, so out throughout your body, whereas the autocrine paracrine function is largely happening directly at the site in your muscle. This has been a well-known target for both DMD and muscular dystrophies for some time. However, the main antibody that was developed a number of years ago by Pfizer did not show clinical benefit in the clinic. And then there was an additional compound that was originally found by BMS and then taken to the clinic by Roche, which was a smaller compound that inhibits myostatin. Both of these inhibitors did not end up showing a clinical benefit in the clinic. And there were a number of reasons that are, I think, now well understood as to why that those compounds simply did not reach this endocrine paracrine inhibition. So they did not very effectively reach the skeletal muscle to where the critical myostatin actually needs to be inhibited. And then they were much better at inhibiting the systemic myostatin, which has a role, but is not enough to actually see an overall clinical benefit in these patients. So with our peptide being much smaller in size, we can also see significant accumulation and or targeting to muscle of this peptide compound. So this is the real critical site of action. And thus far in all of the animal studies, it has shown overwhelmingly positive benefits, far greater than any of the therapeutics we've seen to date that we've done in head-to-head comparisons. And so we are actually currently in the patenting of these compounds, and then once the patenting has been taken care of, we will start to more publicly disclose the various data that we've seen through the animal models. But we have been in contact with a variety of KOLs to discuss this data confidentially and have been planning for clinical development moving forward. Again, we think this is an extremely highly promising approach toward the treatment of DMD and also potentially other muscular dystrophies to which myostatin plays a significant role. So if we go to the next slide. Sorry, this is touching on the peptide-based myostatin inhibitor. So yes, we had compared this to the Pfizer drug as is shown and seen significant benefit across these four critical aspects of necrosis prevention, fatty acid change or fatty change, fibrosis prevention, and also myofibril hypertrophy in these animal models. And again, this is something that we'll present on more in the future here once we have all of the patents filed to cover these compounds. It's something also, as we're working on the clinical development plan, this is something we'll announce more soon here. The goal really for this compound is to utilize the orphan drug designation, breakthrough therapy designations to accelerate our ability to run the clinical trials, largely to be planned in the US, to again accelerate these and shorten the timelines toward an NDA filing. So go to the next slide. So this is just a slide meant to compare the overall PDC, peptide drug conjugate landscape versus antibody drug conjugate landscapes. There's a number of antibody drug conjugates currently approved on the market, about a handful of them. Most of these are actually tied to cytotoxic payloads. At current, none of them are approved with, say, oligo payloads, and there's one that's approved with a radioisotope payload thus far. Antibodies as the targeting vector for these have certain nice benefits, such as their affinity and selectivity, but they have certain other aspects that are, say, not ideal toward using them as the targeting vector for these kind of payload conjugates, as is listed here. Peptides, on the other hand, of course, have many of the same properties as far as their affinity and selectivity. We can get them to be very high affinity, high selective, but they're, we believe, far more ideal in some of the other relevant aspects, making them really perfect candidates for delivering various therapeutic payloads under these kind of peptide conjugate approaches. And so this is why this is a very exciting and growing area across the pharma industry, and PeptiDream is in a excellent position to leverage that with our know-how and expertise in the macrocyclic peptide space. So if you go to the next slide, just touching on the two main areas that we've largely been focused on initially is the peptide oligoconjugate space. On the left side here is kind of a brief history on the of oligonucleotides as drugs. The power of oligonucleotides to silence gene expression and or mRNA expression or protein expression has been well known for some time, but once you actually put these into humans, these oligonucleotide drugs are cut up very quickly and or distribute everywhere in the body, limiting their use and or efficacy. In the early 2000s, it was attempted to encapsulate these largely in lipid nanoparticles. However, there are various manufacturing challenges associated with that, and also challenges once you actually put these into humans, that usually these kind of lipid nanoparticles would fuse very quickly with the first cells they saw. So there was various non-ideal properties to these. In 2010s, roughly, going forward, Alnylam was one of the first companies to really establish what was called GalNAc technology, which was something that allowed, by conjugating these GalNAc molecules to their oligonucleotide drugs, they could actually target these to the liver very effectively, and allowed them to actually dramatically increase their pipeline, with the vast majority of those compounds going after liver-based diseases. Since that has really confirmed the targeting need for the expansion of RI therapeutic space, or the oligotherapeutic space, which has led to the current situation, which is everybody looking for new carrier molecules to target tissues and or sites beyond liver, such as the brain, lung, and or kidney, to which all those type of targets we're working on. So as is shown on the right side of this panel, we originally had identified transferrin receptor binding peptides. Transferrin receptor is overexpressed on both the brain, CNS, and also in muscle. And so we initially licensed these peptides to Takeda for neuromuscular disease applications, to which they're largely looking at oligonucleotide drug payloads, and then also for CNS disease to Takeda for certain oligo payloads. And then there's a number of feasibility studies going on with other partners to potentially license these peptides to deliver other oligonucleotide drugs to the CNS. So there's very much a modular nature of us using these peptides to actually develop multiple products by leveraging various partnerships. In addition to that, in addition to transferrin receptor that can target both muscle and CNS, we have other peptides that we've now found that can allow us to target the CNS for various CNS diseases, and we're in discussions and feasibility studies with various partners there. So we expect future announcements in that area. Also, we've actually been finding other peptides that can target other organs, so not CNS and outside of liver, so such as kidney and lung for the treatment of other various diseases with oligo payloads. Again, part of this is under the Alnylam collaboration, but there's other partners in this space also that we'll be announcing in the near future. And then, of course, there's actually we have a number of peptides toward cancer cell targets, as everyone may know. And so there's a growing amount of evidence toward using oligonucleotide payloads with cancer targeting peptides to develop actually cancer therapeutics. And so that's something that we intend to discuss and or present to the market going forward also in the future. So go to the next slide. This is just attempting to cover a little bit of the peptide radio isotope conjugate space. Again, our original collaboration with Novartis went back from 2019, where our job is to find the peptides against cancer targets of interest. to deliver an RI payload, to which Novartis have the global rights to develop those. We are unlikely to get the Japan rights to those compounds back, but we're making exciting progress across a number of multiple programs, with actually the lead program expected to be developed, disclosed as development candidate, likely here in the second half of this fiscal year or early 2023. And again, number of programs ongoing in that partnership. On the Reid partnership, there's also a number of programs ongoing to which we're finding the cancer targeting peptides. The lead program in that collaboration is also actually expected to be announced here in the second half of this year, with a first development candidate and a number of programs to follow. And as we announced this week, we've actually gotten the Japan development rights to these programs back as part of our expansion of the strategic partnership we have with Reid. And so with no payments back to Reid for these Japan rights. So we actually intend to, of course, use the PDR radio pharma business to allow for the development of those programs, commercialization, and marketing those programs in Japan, products in Japan. In addition to that, we have a number of in-house programs ongoing and other feasibility studies with other companies that are very, very much interested in using our peptides to deliver radio diagnostics and radiotherapeutics, to which we intend to keep Japan rights to all of these programs and simply allow them to have ex-Japan rights to these development programs. So the market, we expect to announce significant progress, of course, these in the second half of this year and also into 2023 across a number of programs here. Of course, as always, please reach out to the RI team with any questions, comments, or any things we could potentially follow up on with. So thank you, everybody.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's conference call. You may now disconnect and have a wonderful rest of the evening.